Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Nader Hashemi. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. And on behalf of the Uyghur Human Rights Project and Democracy in the Arab World Now, welcome to our webinar on Middle East autocrats and China's repression of its Muslim community. The ongoing human rights catastrophe in Xinjiang province facing the Uyghur Muslim population is now well known. It's been extensively documented and globally recognized. Arguably, it remains the worst human rights crisis on the planet today. What is not well known is the role that many governments in the Arab and Islamic world have played in perpetuating this crisis, legitimizing the policies of the Chinese Communist Party, and trying to block international action that could mitigate this human rights catastrophe. To cite just one example, at the height of the genocide facing the Uyghurs, the foreign ministers of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation gathered in the United Arab Emirates for a conference in 2019. At this conference, they issued a document that contained the following passage, quote, "The Organization of Islamic Conference welcomes the outcomes of the visit conducted by the General Secretariat's delegation upon invitation from the People's Republic of China and commends the efforts of the People's Republic of China in providing care to its Muslim citizens and looks forward to further cooperation between the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the People's Republic of China." All 57 members of the OIC, mostly led by dictators, many of whom are US allies, endorsed this statement. To my knowledge, there were no dissenting voices or even debate. More recently, in fact, just last month, China co-sponsored an international conference on Islamophobia at the United Nations, along with other Muslim majority states, but of course, without any mention of the Uyghur genocide by these Muslim countries. It was left to the US ambassador to raise the issue, leading to a verbal spat between the US ambassador and the Chinese ambassador, who accused the United States of trying to ruin China's relationships with the Islamic world. So to help examine this unexamined topic in greater depth is a distinguished panel of experts. Omar Kanat is a Uyghur human rights advocate. He's the executive director of the Uyghur Human Rights Project and executive committee chairman of the World Uyghur Congress. He co-founded the Uyghur Human Rights Project in 2003 and the World Uyghur Congress in 2004. He served as vice president of the World Uyghur Congress since 2006 and chairman of the World Uyghur Congress Executive Committee since 2017. Mr. Kanat was born in the city of Guljain in East Turkestan, and he immigrated at the age of 10. Bradley Jardine is the managing director of the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs. His work focuses on China's security interests in Central Asia, the growth of Chinese military contractors and surveillance companies in the region, and the ways in which Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region influences Chinese foreign policy making in Eurasia. John Hoffman is the research director at Democracy for the Arab World Now, known as DAWN. He's also a PhD candidate at George Mason University and is set to defend his dissertation this month, examining how Middle East governments utilize religion as a tool of statecraft. He just authored a wonderful piece in Foreign Policy on the manipulation of religion by Mideast autocrats. I highly recommend that. And last, but certainly not least, is Maya Wang. She's the associate director in the Asia division at Human Rights Watch. Wang has researched and written extensively on a wide range of issues in China, including use of torture, arbitrary detention, the abuse of human rights defenders, civil society, disability rights, and women's rights. She's also an expert on human rights in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet. And in recent years, her original research on China's use of technology for mass surveillance has helped galvanize international attention on these developments in China and globally. So the format that we agreed upon is that I've asked each of the panelists to speak for between 10 and 12 minutes. I did warn them in advance that if they exceed this time, I will interrupt them. So after the preliminary presentations are completed, we'll have a little bit of time for discussion and questions from the viewing audience. We plan to end this webinar around 12:15 Eastern Standard Time. And I'd like to begin by asking Omar to go first, followed by Bradley, John, and then Maya. Omar, the floor is yours for the next 12 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. I think I have some problem with my video. So it says that the host enabled this video. I can not. So sorry for that. So
we'll try and get that fixed, Omar. But you
thank
can
you so much.
speaking. You continue speaking while we get your video up. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yes. Hello and good morning, everybody. UHRP very pleased to co-sponsor this event, and we thank Don for organizing. More than 1 billion Muslims around the world are currently celebrating Ramadan. But for Uyghurs, it is a time of unspeakable suffering. Our brothers and sisters in our homeland cannot observe Ramadan. They cannot fast. They cannot read the Quran. They cannot even pray at their homes. Otherwise, they risk being sent to a torture cell in a concentration camp. Inside the concentration camps, I can tell you the words of a Uyghur woman who managed to survive the camp. Gulbahar spent 2 years in the camps. Her family was already in France, and her family campaigned for her release. Eventually, the French government put enough pressure on the Chinese government, and the Chinese government decided that they had to let her go. At that time, she weighed less than 100 pounds. She had scars all over her ankles because of the chains on her legs. So first, before they returned her passport, the Chinese government put her in a special apartment. They kept her there for several weeks so that she could recover from her injuries and malnutrition by eating good foods and sleeping. This is what she has testified. We were beaten if we prayed. We had to be careful not to put both hands to our mouth when we were eating, because the guard said you are secretly praying. We could not close our eyes for even a few moments when we were in the political indoctrination classes for 11 hours every day. If we closed our eyes, the guard said we were praying and punished us severely. But it was more than punishment for praying. We had to learn new prayers to praise and thank Communist Party instead of Allah. Before each class and before we ate, we had to say 3 praises. We had to praise the Communist Party, we had to praise the great nation of China, and we had to praise Xi Jinping. Then, after each class and each meal, we had to give thanks in the same way. Outside the camps, our mosques and pilgrimage sites have been bulldozed. According to Australian Strategic Policy Institute, 16,000 mosques have been destroyed or desecrated since 2017. One mosque was made into a nightclub, another was made into a public toilet. The remaining are tourist sites. In the Uyghur homeland, the government puts criminal label on all normal religious practices, calling them Islamic extremism and an ideological disease. The government has outlawed a list of names that were considered too Islamic. For example, we cannot give names like Muhammad and Aisha to our children. Uyghurs are monitored to ensure that they do not fast during the Ramadan. Just saying Assalamu alaikum was enough for the government to label Uyghurs as Islamic extremists. In 2021, UHRP and Justice for All issued a joint report on the mass detention of Uyghur Imams. We compiled a list of 46 Imams in East Turkestan who were detained since 2014. Because people are severely punished for even talking on the phone with anyone in a foreign country, we know that it was amazing to collect so much information. Of course, it is the tip of the iceberg, and true number is much larger. In some cases, the Imam's entire family was also detained and taken into the camps. Not only their children, but also their grandchildren. Muhammad Salih Hajim, who translated the Holy Quran from Arabic into Uyghur, as part of a government project, a government-approved project, many years ago, in one of this camps. Qayyum Khan Qari is another Imam, Uyghur Imam, who died in custody. Imam Qayyum Khan was first arrested more than 30 years ago after serving a 15 years sentence. He was released in 2006. Then in 2017, as the mass detention program began, he was re-arrested. 2 years after he was taken to a camp, authorities gave his dead body to his family. Just 1 month ago, on March 9, we heard about yet another death in custody. In 2018, a religious leader named Bakht Khan Marjan, who is Kazakh, was sentenced by Xinjiang authorities to 14 years in prison for leading prayers on special occasions. His sister, Alma Khan Marjan, who lives in Kazakhstan, confirmed to journalists that her brother had died in prison at the age of 61. But it's not only Imams. Every Uyghur family has had relatives taken away. The leaked documents called the Xinjiang police files, which were published in May 2022, include police photos of people as young as 14 and as old as 82 taken into police station. Even children as young as 6 can be found in the files. We estimate that at least 1 million Uyghur children have been taken from their families and put into the custody of the state. In these so-called boarding schools, they suffer the grief of losing all contacts with their parents and families. The children are intensively trained to hate Islam. They shout slogans every day praising the Communist Party and declaring their loyalty to the Chinese state. But the government goes even further to make sure the Uyghur women will not have children at all in the future. Police have called in all women to have forced insertion of birth control, or they are sterilized by force. Men and women are forced to work in factories as slave laborers, so they cannot marry and form families. The birth rate dropped by 50% between 2017 and 2019. Truly, it's a plan to make the Uyghurs disappear. That's why we say it is a pure genocide. The US has imposed 110 targeted sanctions in the form of visa bans and global Magnitsky sanctions, forced labor import bans, high-tech export bans, and investment bans. 11 parliaments around the world have passed resolutions condemning the atrocities. The UN High Commissioner on Human Rights issued a report on the August 31st, 2022, confirming evidence of torture, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, and other international human rights crimes. The report concluded that they may amount to crimes against humanity. 3 times since January 2022, the International Labour Organization has made unprecedented statements of concern about China's state-sponsored forced labor program. Detailed parliamentary hearings and inquiries have been held in Canada, the UK, Germany, Belgium, and the United States. Uyghur leaders have provided briefings for national legislators in these countries, as well as in Canberra, Ankara, Tokyo, Taipei, Dublin, and many other capitals. Uyghurs have spoken at the UN forum despite Chinese diplomats' attempts to block them. But there has been no resolution of condemnation and no official inquiry or hearing in any Muslim majority country. Of course, the Chinese government says that any criticism of its action is a plot by the West to prevent China's rise. China floods the media in many Muslim majority countries with stories saying the suffering of Uyghurs is, quote, the lie of the century. The bottom line is that China has succeeded in recruiting non-democratic governments to deny that it is carrying out Islamophobia and genocide. As you recall, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, custodian of the two holy sites of Islam, went to Beijing in 2019 and defended the Chinese government by repeating its talking points. He justified China's actions as anti-terrorism and de-extremization work for its national security. This is repeated by people like Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan. He openly defended China's actions against Uyghurs in 2021 and again in 2022. The Islamic Cooperation Organization has been meeting for the purpose of highlighting, quote, the unity of the Muslim Ummah in the face of very serious challenges facing the world. But their silence on the suffering of Uyghur Muslims is crushing. In March 2022, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution to create the UN Anti-Islamophobia Day. But Uyghurs are asking, where are the OIC voices on the crushing of the Uyghurs? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Omar, for that presentation, and also thank you for being exactly on time. We now turn to Bradley Jardine. Bradley, the floor is yours for the next 12 minutes.
Great. Well, thank you very much for hosting me today. And Omar, thank you so much for those powerful words and testimonies from individuals. I think that helps us better understand the situation that's been unfolding within Xinjiang in past years. My talk will mainly focus on China's strategic interests in the Middle East. These also act as points of leverage, which it exerts for repression of Uyghur diaspora communities who happen to reside particularly in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. And then I'll talk more about the issue of transnational repression and how China leverages its relationships with the region to suppress Uyghur communities and their cultural and religious practices in the region. To begin, China's, of course, has long and historic relations with much of the Muslim world, which fits within its diplomatic discourse, within its Silk Roads framework and dialogue around Silk Road economic belt and so on, which, you know, is a core tranche of its diplomatic agenda in the region. But really its modern relations started in the late 80s with the opening up and reform of the economy, which led to the demand for more hydrocarbons from the region. Today, the region has accounts for a large share of the diversification of China's energy supplies, which has strategic imperatives in the Indo-Pacific, of course. A lot of Chinese strategists have focused on this so-called Malacca dilemma, the suggestion that the US would control choke points that would allow for the closing off of energy supplies. So there's been a large focus on using these Eurasian land corridors, particularly in Central Asia and the Middle East, to diversify energy supplies and energy routes. Other parts of China's agenda in the region are, of course, strategic and military. The region's a large consumer of Chinese military technology. This has been part of a long-standing strategy by China, which was once long dependent on Russian weapon supplies. It's now become, in the past decade or so, a large supplier in its own right. And across the region, there are large-scale purchases of Chinese weapon systems, which allow it to bolster its market share. It's a strategy it's also pursued in Central Asia, where it's increasingly a competitor of Russian weapon systems. And in the Middle East, China supplies core strategic technologies such as weaponized drone systems, which often can't be purchased from alternative suppliers. So China really does have strategic broader ambitions there, of course, with its security agreements and joint exercises and drills in the region. And then there's, of course, the economic dimension beyond energy security, which is that the Middle East accounts for a huge tranche of the Belt and Road project and its overall success. Some 30% or so of total infrastructure investments related to the Belt and Road have occurred in the Middle East and North Africa, which just shows the significance of the region to the overall success of the project, and connecting, of course, a land corridor between Europe and Asia, which is the ultimate long-term trade agenda of the Belt and Road Agreement. And this gives China a lot of economic leverage in the region, being seen as one of the major suppliers of investment and infrastructure at this point, as well as technology transfers, which I can discuss later. And then finally, there's, of course, diplomatic support. So as Omar has noted, as the repression has unfolded within Xinjiang, getting local buy-in from Middle Eastern powers, particularly Saudi Arabia, which carry and command a lot of moral authority and weight within the Muslim world, has been an important tranche of China's whitewashing strategy of its human rights abuses and atrocities in the region. Part of this has come through organized statements and briefings have come from countries around the region, as well as building up relationships with religious institutions in the region, and also academic institutions. Often China's long regulated its discourse within the framework of the Chinese Islamic Association, which is an organization within China which regulates religious discourse, but also releases press releases in Arabic language across much of the region. So often at key critical points where China is receiving a lot of criticism and backlash, you'll actually see increased activities, press releases, briefings, organized press tours, and such things to counteract those critical narratives. We've recently seen that with the organized tour that took place in Xinjiang, but this is a long-term strategy that's been existent for decades. And finally, with China's approach to Islam, particularly within its Muslim borderlands, it's never been a static process of, in the sense that sometimes China's leveraged its Islamic population as a way of bridging relationships with these parts of the world. Early diplomatic engagement with the Middle East started really as part of a process to diplomatically isolate Taiwan. Many of the regimes in the region in the 1970s recognized the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, and China really sought to bridge its relations by leveraging actually Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities within China to go on diplomatic tours to persuade them to recognize the One China policy. So that was really the tranche and core of its early diplomatic engagements with the region. More recently, of course, as China's turned toward a far more securitized approach toward its Muslim minorities, and with radical nationalist policies, which really emphasize the Sinicization of Islam, whereby Islam and religious practices within China are seen as being uniquely Chinese in their origin, which is part of a larger strategy to really isolate Xinjiang Uyghur cultural traditions from the wider Muslim world, which is seen as part of the securitized threat. I mean, if you look at Chinese state media and propaganda within Xinjiang, at least since 2014, when China embarked on its so-called People's War on Terror, there's been a lot of rhetoric about religious extremism, the so-called three evil forces rhetoric that China first developed within Central Asia and is exported to other parts of the world through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There's a lot more talk of Salafism and radical strains of Islam entering Xinjiang, which Chinese authorities have been using as part of their justification for the mass internment campaign and the mass atrocities which Omar outlined within his discussion. Part of this is, of course, a discussion of broader trends of engagement between the Uyghurs and the wider Muslim world, where when we look at the growing repression that's been taking shape and unfolding within Xinjiang, there's also been an external campaign of transnational repression, an external campaign of silencing any voices that may draw attention, critical attention towards China's practices in Xinjiang, or even just cultural engagement with the Muslim world, which of course has key pilgrimage sites of Mecca, and of course religious educational institutions such as Al-Azhar in Egypt, which are major points at which the Uyghur interact with their wider Muslim community. China's of course become more deeply suspicious of these engagements, seeing them less as a tool that it can leverage for its own diplomatic engagements and more as a potential security threat. That's how the regime in Beijing defines the situation. As part of the Sinicization drive we mentioned, where there's been changes of mosques, the erasure of cultural landscapes in Xinjiang, the reorientation towards Chinese Han nationalist political agenda within China more broadly, but also within being promoted within Xinjiang. There's been ways of disconnecting the Uyghurs from their connections with much of the wider Muslim world. Part of this has been through long-standing strategies. For example, there's long been political controls over who can attend the Hajj pilgrimage. These controls have been tightened severely in recent years with restrictions on the age of participants and also the level of invasive surveying that has to be done in order to get a permit to be able to partake in these state-directed Hajj visits. So there's been severe limitations, quota systems that have been put in place restricting Uyghur participation. And even far more reports now of Chinese intelligence services participating and surveilling individuals throughout their trips to the region. Then, of course, there's the closing down of sites of religious education. Part of the problem for this is that within Xinjiang and the coordinated targeting of Uyghur and other Turkic peoples, there's been a huge blacklist that's been devised by the Xinjiang security services, which has blacklisted 26 Muslim majority countries, including much of the Middle East. This blacklist has actually facilitated mass detention because Uyghurs who actually have cultural connections with Middle Eastern countries are targeted specifically for that very reason. If you studied in Egypt, you can be detained, sent to a re-education center. If you're communicating with individuals, even your own family members who happen to be residing in Saudi Arabia, that's grounds for detention and re-education. So this has been an active campaign of severing links between Uyghurs and their compatriots, diaspora community who live in the Middle East, but also in other parts of the world as well. But the campaign has largely focused on the Middle East and Pakistan, which have been seen by the Xinjiang security services as the most problematic from China's perspective. Part of the ways of severing these ties is a strategy of intensified securitization of passports, where there's just been huge restrictions on who is entitled to receive a passport. The Chinese authorities and police services within Xinjiang often force people to give up their passports, keeping them for quote unquote safekeeping with local officials. This, of course, restricts their freedom of movement, freedom to engage with their cultural practices, such as partaking in the Hajj pilgrimage, but also stopping the flow of information between Uyghurs diaspora who are living overseas and Uyghurs within Xinjiang, who may report and discuss the types of abuses they're being subject to. So this is a way of silencing essentially any activism that may emerge or any critical narratives that may spread among diaspora communities in the region. This is a way of China locking down its narrative. Then, of course, there's the building and leveraging of economic ties with the region. As I noted, China is a large-scale military supplier, security provider, and also an economic player in the region. It, of course, uses these tools to exert a lot of leverage and control. Part of this is diplomatic concessions. We've seen this now with 2 letters that have been signed supporting China's conduct within Xinjiang at the UN level, which have been signed by a lot of partner countries in the Middle East. This is an example of how these political and material mechanisms and frames of support can turn into real diplomatic wins on China's part, or at least building out alliances for which it can counter critical narratives of its conduct in the region. There's also, of course, the tightening of religious education. Hundreds or even thousands of Uyghurs for many years have been traveling to Cairo, where they've been studying Al-Azhar, which is one of the most prominent Islamic education facilities in the world. In 2017, there was a huge crackdown in which hundreds of Uyghurs were detained. Some of them have claimed in their witness reports that Chinese intelligence officials were present in Egyptian prison facilities and had interrogated some of them, and many of them were returned to Xinjiang, several of whom have died in police custody since their return. This really shows the gravity of how economic linkages with regimes in the Middle East can really turn into hard power and really extending China's security dragnet from Xinjiang to much of the wider world. So where now students living and studying overseas are now at risk of being detained, thrown in the back of police vans, and even deported. Other examples of this practice are, of course, the renditions and extraditions that have been taking place across the region. Sometimes when China builds its economic linkages and Belt and Road agreements and its security agreements with countries in the region, those agreements have embedded within them extradition clauses and treaties. Many of the countries in the Middle East have signed extradition treaties with China, which means that when China declares someone a threat to its stability or security, those individuals can be detained on grounds of the legal agreements.
Bradley, can I ask you to summarize as quickly as possible?
Sure. So in summary, as China's expanded its diplomatic, military, and economic linkages with the Middle East, it's put at threat the Uyghur community, links between Uyghur religious practices in the region, and it's created far less space for political activism or political support from Muslims and ethnic co-patriots in the region who have been effectively silenced.
Great. Thank you very much, Bradley. Very insightful. There's a lot there to unpack and discuss. Hopefully we can get to it in the discussion period. John, the floor is yours for the next 12 minutes.
Thank you, Nutter. And thank you, everybody, for being here, and to UHRP for sponsoring with us on this event. The driving impetus behind this event was really a recent visit in January, early January this year. It was a delegation of roughly 30 Islamic scholars from 14 Muslim majority countries, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, the UAE, Tunisia. And they traveled to Xinjiang in China, and they expressed their ardent support for Beijing's policies towards its Muslim population. The event was organized by the World Muslim Communities Council, which is an organization founded in the UAE, and they put out a statement hailing the, quote, efforts of Chinese authorities in combating terrorism in Xinjiang, and praised the interest and determination of the Chinese leadership to serve all in the region. These visits are becoming a lot more common, as are declarations of support from Muslim majority countries, particularly within the Middle East. Governments and religious scholars in the Middle East have emerged as key partners supporting Beijing's efforts to Sinicize Islam, as we've heard in this panel. And as the world enters into a new period of multipolarity, a great deal of attention has been devoted to China's expanding diplomatic, economic, and military presence in the Middle East. Often neglected, though, is this dramatic increase in religious engagement between Middle East autocrats and China. Aside from solely buttressing the relationships between these governments and Beijing, such cooperation and coordination advances the interest of states such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, and others who have increasingly sought to establish a monopoly, a global monopoly, on religious practice and interpretation, particularly following the 2011 Arab uprisings. So cooperation with Beijing regarding the repression of its Muslim population has quickly evolved into a critical tool of statecraft, buttressing these relationships, buttressing these, a stronger Chinese presence within the Middle East, but also serves to advance the interests of countries such as Saudi or the UAE or Egypt, both at home and abroad. As we've heard in the presentations today, China increasingly views the very, quote, Muslimness of its Muslim community as a security threat to its internal cohesion that increasingly needs to be contained from their point of view. Therefore, they've embarked on a strategy to forcibly Sinicize Islam. Beijing has detained over 1 million Muslims and is holding them in internment camps where they face torture, are often forced to renounce Islam, pledge loyalty to the Communist Party, and are often executed for their non-compliance. Additionally, China has adopted very draconian measures such as slashing, in order to slash birth rates among its domestic Muslim population via forced IUDs, forced abortions, and forced sterilizations. Beijing has worked very hard to keep Muslim majority countries silent regarding these abuses. As part of this effort to Sinicize Islam, a central objective of China has been to separate Islam in China from global Islam, from the global Islamic community. The Communist Party describes Muslims in China as, quote, infected by an ideological illness, and stress, quote, if we do not eradicate religious extremism at its roots, the violent terrorist incidents will grow and spread all over like an incurable malignant tumor. Middle East governments have emerged as a key partner for Beijing in part of these efforts. Heavily dependent on Chinese trade, investment, and oil markets, many Middle East governments are happy to not only remain silent, but praise Beijing's efforts and actively cooperate with them to control its Muslim population. In 2019, 37 states, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt, all signed a letter to the President of the United Nations Human Rights Council, praising China's, quote, contribution to the international human rights cause, claiming that China has restored peace and security after facing, quote, terrorism, separatism, and extremism in Xinjiang. Just this past October 2022, the UN Human Rights Council voted down a Western-led motion to hold a debate about alleged human rights abuses taking place in Xinjiang, just voted down even having a debate on it, after countries such as Qatar, Indonesia, Sudan, Pakistan, and the UAE rejected the motion. Political leaders in these countries often directly express their support for Beijing's policies. Omar noted the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's visit to China in 2019, where he stated, China has the right to take anti-terrorism and de-extremism measures to safeguard their national security. Such support is often lauded by Chinese officials. In January of last year, Chinese Foreign Minister stated that the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, expressed support for China's, quote, legitimate positions on issues related to Taiwan, Xinjiang, and human rights. But beyond simply praising these efforts, as we've heard, many countries in the Middle East actively cooperate with China to arrest and deport Uyghur Muslims back to China at the request of Beijing. Chinese intelligence and security officers regularly operate alongside their Middle East counterparts. And there's been recently a lot of news about black sites that are being hosted in the UAE, a Chinese-run secret detention facility in Dubai used to target, detain, and deport Uyghurs. And these black sites within the UAE, according to numerous testimonies from Uyghur exiles, are often operated directly by Chinese authorities within the Emirates. So this religious cooperation has really emerged as a complementary tool of statecraft. And of course, the growing economic and geopolitical interest between Middle East autocrats and China is imperative, but this needs to be situated within a broader religio-political context that has emerged within the Middle East following the Arab uprisings. A primary objective of these governments since the uprisings has been to establish a monopoly on religious discourse, a state monopoly, and the construction of a state-controlled interpretation of Islam, designed primarily to discredit those who oppose their authority or the broader status quo. China has worked with such actors to promote a state-controlled religious narrative that protects the respective domestic and foreign interests of these regimes as well as Beijing. Increased engagement with Beijing serves to further the efforts of Middle East autocrats to establish a global hegemony over Islamic discourse in the post-uprisings era. So a primary objective of these governments since the uprisings has been to delegitimize all manifestations of Islamic practice or interpretation outside of the strict confines of state control by attempting to maintain a monopoly on state discourse. They share this interest with China. China seeks to, bring Islam under the authority, the strict authority of the state, specifically the Communist Party. Increased cooperation with China on these issues is therefore not only a way to strengthen their overall relationships with Beijing, especially as China increases its footprint in the Middle East, but also furthers the efforts of these Middle East autocrats to control and direct Islam at a global level according to their own interests. In conclusion, I would say, as China continues to expand its presence in the Middle East, while simultaneously ramping up the repression of its domestic Muslim community, this cooperation, unfortunately, can be expected to continue and will likely expand moving forward if adequate measures are not taken.
Great, thank you, John, for that broader, religio-political context in terms of how Middle East autocrats relate and engage with China. And last but not least, we have Maya Wang. I'm not sure if you prefer to speak off camera or with your camera on. It's completely up to you. The floor is yours.
Great. I'm going to join via audio. And thank you so much for Don and UHRP to invite me today, and for the other speakers who spoke ahead of me. I think it's quite clear that I've been asked to talk about what governments or what the international community can do about what's happening in Xinjiang. So far, the response internationally has been quite muted, to be honest, compared to the gravity of the abuses. So taking stock, you have the European Union, the UK, the US, and Canada imposing targeted sanctions, meaning travel bans and asset freezes on top officials in Xinjiang. Although Australia in 2021 passed legislation that would enable the government to do similar sanctions, it has not really done that. So this is what governments outside of China has done, which is not really that very much, although commendable. But we need much more to hold the Chinese government accountable. And what is at stake is not, well, of course, obviously, the millions of people in Xinjiang and the human rights of people in China, but also, what is at stake is the universality of the UN human rights system. Now we have essentially a very powerful government that abuses people and deepening repression, putting people in camps with impunity. And we have a lot of governments just looking the other way, and that collectively undermined our system that protects human rights everywhere. And the Muslim majority countries, as a number of speakers have said, have done very little, and the little that they have done are not entirely consistent. Now, there are a number of countries that have done something. Albania and Turkey, for example, signed on to a joint statement at the UN in September 2022 that condemned the Chinese government for its abuses of Uyghurs. Turkey also, because of its big, because of its seeing that it has tied to essentially to the Uyghurs in China, has spoken out more over the years for Uyghurs. Though that's not, as I said, been entirely consistent. Indonesia, a democracy that I think one would naturally hope that it would be standing up strong for the human rights, nonetheless have fallen more into China's orbit over the years and have been more on the fence over the issue of Uyghurs, to most recently at the UN and in a recent vote to discuss the abuses of Xinjiang. Indonesia actually voted no to discuss the issue. So you can see that the uphill battle here is that there are very few Muslim majority countries willing to stand up for the Uyghurs. And then it reinforces kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy that the Chinese government says, well, the whole issue surrounding Xinjiang is a Western plot to discredit China. So we need more governments to impose consequences for China, reputational cost for crimes against humanity at the very least. And that means, imposing visa bans, travel bans, targeted sanctions. They should also publicly condemn these rights abuses and also specify that they amount to crimes against humanity. They should also facilitate prosecutions against Chinese government officials on the basis of universal jurisdiction laws. And governments with countries with Uyghur diasporas, and that pretty much applies to much of the Middle East. I think other speakers have mentioned that Uyghurs have been forcibly returned from countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and so on. So the risk of forced return remains very high. And I think a basic ask has been that these governments do not return Uyghurs to a place where they face torture and arbitrary detention, and give them access to a fair system for adjudicating asylum requests. Should facilitate family unification, allowing families to travel to to join them in these countries where they may be safer. And also create some kind of systems to track harassment of Uyghurs and Turkic Muslims in other countries. What happens is that the Chinese government has been actively harassing and intimidating Uyghurs even outside of the Chinese borders. And we haven't really seen governments really tracking these harassment or protecting Uyghurs from such kind of harassment. Because of a lot of Xinjiang, in terms of companies, because of a lot of Xinjiang's abuses are facilitated by the use of technologies procured by private companies. We have also asked governments to impose sanctions on surveillance companies involved or supporting the Chinese government's system of forced labor in Xinjiang. Some governments, again, have imposed such sanctions, primarily Western governments. But more could be done. It could be also in the form of, I think it was Canada in January 2021, publishing a public advisory to companies, telling them about the business risk of doing business in Xinjiang, and telling them about the human rights abuses in Xinjiang. Now, finally, I would say civil society has played a very important role in raising awareness about the abuses. And civil society in Muslim majority countries have also been quite active. I've met with groups, for example, in Indonesia that have, protested and spoken out about these abuses. Having said that, there is a really, in many Muslim majority countries, there is really no functional civil society, given that many of them are authoritarian. But those that are, like in places like Indonesia, there's a gap between foreign policy and what the civil society are advocating for. And then in a place also like Indonesia, where there is civil society, the Chinese government has also spent a lot of effort cultivating opinion leaders who are Muslim scholars, Muslim groups and organizations that are powerful. And, groups like human rights groups like us have very little ability sometimes to penetrate that kind of charm offensive. And then in a place like Indonesia, on top of that, some of the groups that have been speaking up about Uyghurs also are the same groups that have been themselves rallied against religious minorities in their own countries, making it very hard because it just becomes this kind of endless double standards where human rights are words bandied about because you want to kind of criticize your political opponent rather than really committing to the universality of human rights, that all groups, when they are abused, deserve to have to be supported and to be protected. So I think in the case of Uyghurs, unfortunately, we are in a minefield of many different kinds of double standards, where we have a situation where a lot of Western governments have spoken out for the Uyghurs, and ironically, lots of Muslim majority countries governments have failed to speak up. And the same governments that have long criticized Western governments for their own, for these governments, double standards when it comes to human rights. So I would just end there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Maya. That was very informative, particularly the internal situation in Indonesia with respect to the role of civil society and the role of the Indonesian government and the contradictions in terms of, speaking out for human rights in one part of the Islamic world, but not the other. Look, I'm going to ask people who want to pose a question, if you haven't already, to post it in the Q&A session. I'm going to ask my colleague Sophie to read them out in a moment. But I want to just begin quickly, since we're talking about Mideast autocrats, governments in the Arab Islamic world, and the persecution of the Uyghurs. I want to ask Omar a question, if she agrees with Maya's statement that among the Muslim majority countries in the world, it's really Turkey and then Albania that have done the most with respect to speaking out in defense of the Uyghurs. Would you agree with that categorization, or are there any other countries that you would want to add to that list? Omar?
Yes, I basically agree with Maya. So Turkey, because the Uyghurs have very close historical, linguistic, and cultural and religious relations with people in Turkey, and also there is a big Uyghur diaspora in Turkey who are very active. So therefore, because of the public is very aware of what's happening to the Uyghurs. So therefore, because of the public pressure, the government has been, as Maya also said, not very, it's not very consistent, but sometimes it two or three times supported the Uyghur statements at the UN, and also initiated even one at the UN. So this was, we were very grateful for that, but Turkey can do more, even because now I think according to my information, there are about 200 Turkish citizens, Uyghur Turkish citizens, who are in the concentration camps. Their relatives are in Turkey. So the Turkish government even couldn't, Kazakhstan managed to rescue the Kazakhs from the concentration camps, Kazakh citizens, and bring them back to Kazakhstan. And as I mentioned in my remarks, France government, somehow managed to get Gulbahar out of the camp and bring to France. But the Turkish government was not, has not been very aggressive in his efforts to rescue these Uyghur Turkish citizens who are still in the suffering in Chinese concentration camps. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go to some of the questions. I think just in the interest of time, maybe Sophie, if you could read maybe 3 questions, if we have 3 questions, and then we'll ask the panelists to pick and choose any of the questions to respond. Go ahead, Sophie.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your insights on this important topic. I'm Sophie. I'm from Dawn Democracy for the Arab World Now. We've gotten some great questions in the Q&A, so I'll just read a few. Number 1, which Islamic countries / Muslim countries have condemned this crime? What is the reason that some Islamic countries close their eyes? The second question, has there been any evolution, positive or negative, of US policy or reaction to the situation? Has it varied from Trump to Biden? And the third question, this is directed at John. Do you think there are any justification to China's fear of Islamic extremism in Xinjiang, or is it complete fabrication? If there is some truth to it, what would be the appropriate approach to it? I guess we can start with number 1. Bradley, I think you want to take this.
Sure, I can add some thoughts there. I think Maya and Omar have both already outlined some great points that the increased space for civil society in Indonesia, Malaysia, Turkey, and Albania has created more critical feedback there than it has in other parts of the world. But part of the reason is the fragmented interests of much of the Muslim world. You know, this is a vast region that spans most of the globe. It has very different interests. For example, Pakistan has been very silent on the Uyghur issue, despite being very vocal on other issues, such as the rights of Palestinians. Part of the reason for that is that Pakistan's locked in a geopolitical struggle with India, and China's its major arms supplier and its major investor. China has broader strategic interests that lead to it aligning with China, even on issues that are contentious within its own domestic society. Neighboring Central Asia has really had a very complex relationship with China's security crackdown. States such as Kazakhstan are longtime allies of China, both through the Belt and Road initiative, but also through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where they've long been partners, and they've essentially for decades been suppressing Uyghur civil society there in exchange for economic and trade concessions from China. However, part of the complexity there has been that there has been some critical feedback from Central Asia, less so over the situation of the Uyghurs, but more broadly of the situation of their ethnic compatriots. What people forget often is that with the crackdown that's taking place in Xinjiang, it's also brought other ethnic minorities within that dragnet, including ethnic Kyrgyz and ethnic Kazakhs. So this has often inflamed portions of civil society in Kazakhstan, where there's been a lot of criticism of China's actions, and it's put the government into a difficult position where it wants to balance its relations with China, but it has to gain concessions for its public. So this has led to a lot of backdoor diplomacy with China for the release of certain Kazakh prisoners, some of whom have relocated to Kazakhstan. So there has been some critical feedback in different regions.
Great.
Can I add?
Go ahead, Omar.
Yeah, this is also for Uyghurs. It's very frustrating what's happening in Muslim world, regarding the Uyghurs. So I think it is also China has been, in propagating, giving, spreading misinformation, and also very active in Muslim countries to tell their side of the story, the narrative. Many were Muslim already convinced, Muslim leaders that what China says is true. It's and also China is, as John also indicated, constantly inviting Muslim journalists, Muslim delegation to East Turkestan, and they are preparing the stage visits, and they are showing the people, these delegation, where they want to show, and letting them to talk to the people who they want to talk. And it was very interesting that early morning we had a webinar in Indonesia. I attended this webinar, and Imam, who visited with a delegation recently East Turkestan and Urumqi in the cities, confronted me, and he said that what you are saying is not true. I saw by my own eyes that Uyghurs enjoying their life, they are prospered and enjoying their culture, their religion. They are practicing their religion freely. So it is very disappointing, very frustrating for us, when an Imam came out and came up and say that what we are saying is wrong, what the Chinese government is doing with the Uyghurs, they're right, and Uyghurs are having freedom of religion, freedom of faith, so they are free to do whatever they want. So even he showed some video footages of the mosques that the people are there. So China is very smart, very good in this, fooling the people and staging these kind of senses, and show the people that, and he also showed the video footage of dancing Uyghurs in these so-called re-education comes. This is really frustrating, but China China is very, very active in promoting its story and trying to convince the Muslim population, Muslim leaders, what the Uyghurs are saying is a lie, and it is a Western plot.
Conspiracy, right? Omar, a quick question. I mean, we have no expectations of, the Arab world or the Islamic world speaking out for the Uyghurs, largely because they're living under authoritarian regimes. But in the West, where you have Muslim communities that live in, liberal democracies, have you seen anything in specific terms in any Western country that has a Muslim minority population where there has been good activism and solidarity with the Uyghurs that you would want to note for us? Or is it basically silenced like it is in the rest of the Islamic world?
No, there are Muslim communities in especially in the US, I can say, in the UK, in many Western countries. There are many groups, Muslim groups, who are supporting the Uyghurs. NGOs, Muslim NGOs, human rights groups who are supporting the Uyghurs. So there are now some movements even in Muslim countries, because we were not able to convince any mainstream media to cover the Uyghur issue, because we heard from the journalists that there is instructions from the top leadership, the governments, not to cover the Uyghur issue. So therefore, the journalists in mainstream media cannot cover the Uyghur issue. So now, thanks to the social media, we have been using the social media, social influencer, Muslim social influencer also, to spread the word and to raise awareness among the Muslim population. When they know what is really happening, they are, sympathizing with us and they are taking action. We have experienced that. We saw that, if the Muslim population really know what is really happening in East Turkestan against the Muslim people, then they take action. So we have to work hard to raise awareness, to let them know what is really happening. So, and then there will be some movements in the Muslim world as well.
Thank you. So question 2 and 3, I think, fall really very much to John and to Maya. But John, do you want to answer the question that was posed to you about security concerns and extremism that often gets discussed in the context of Chinese policy toward the Uyghurs?
Yeah, of course. I'll take this, and then if Maya wants to do the question regarding differences between administrations. Mm-hmm. But yeah, of course. So I think, taking a step back and examining this question in the post 9/11 era, this war on terror, this label of terrorism has become a very convenient scapegoat across the entire world for people to repress their domestic populations or repress populations abroad. I saw on the question, the question about extremism among Uyghurs, and there were some reports about an incredibly small number of Uyghurs who have engaged in transnational movements, but this accounts to 0.00001% of the Uyghurs, and what we're seeing is the wide-scale mass repression of a people under the guise of countering terrorism, under the guise of preventing extremism, when this is in actuality a campaign to target and eradicate an entire community and bring it under the sole authority of the CCP.
Great. Maya, do you want to take on the question about U.S. policy? I'll just read it again for everyone so that we're all on the same page. Has there been any evolution, positive or negative, of U.S. policy toward the situation of the Uyghurs? Has it varied from Trump to Biden?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the irony is that I do think that the Trump administration very significantly steered U.S. policy on China from one that was kind of basically based on business. Both the Clinton administration and then the Obama administration were pretty much about doing business in China. We kind of looked the other way. Things are really good. And then I think the Trump administration is when that a mix of, this China stealing our jobs and, the Chinese government is just bad kind of rhetoric. That shift was very significant. And I think that should be essentially recognized. Although, of course, the Trump administration was also, of course, known for its own very hostile approach to human rights, and to say that it holds double standards between, condemning the abuses of Uyghurs in China, and on the other hand, the Trump administration also imposed its own kind of quote Muslim ban. To call that a double standard is probably an understatement. What the Trump administration did essentially by doing so is to further undermine the whole idea that we're talking about universal standards. There are something that we all want, and when people are abused, we should speak up for them. The lack of consistency or the undermining of consistency really deal a very big damage, I think, to our international system. And when the Biden administration came along, I think the orientation towards China as one that I think the US and China in a competition in terms of values and in terms of power, I think that kind of continues. But I think the Biden administration can be credited with much more consistent approach, both in terms of China policy. It has much more on the table, I think, whether or not we're talking about trade, economics, and how to work with allies on China policy and centering China in its foreign policy, as well as putting human rights in a greater priority. So it does seem to treat human rights a bit more seriously, at least compared to the Trump administration. On the other hand, the Biden administration is, I think, falling into kind of the new Cold War dynamics, where they are courting a lot of fairly unsavory characters and governments, whether or not we're talking about India, which is essentially now becoming going from a democracy to growing authoritarianism tendencies, and the Biden administration wanting to court all the Asia Pacific countries and turning a blind eye to a region that is becoming more and more and more authoritarian over the last decade. And that is a lost opportunity, in my opinion, because if you say human rights are really important, democracy is very important, then you need to live by these standards. And what we see is that the US continues to say they're important, but underneath that, I don't see much of that support in actual practice on a global scale that is actually concrete and beyond rhetoric. Yeah, and that also...
Go ahead.
Sorry, that also answers another question, which I think has not been read out, was about what Western states should do. And this is where I think when I was describing what governments can do, you could already see that beyond condemnation, beyond sanctions, there is protecting the Uyghur community from harassment, from intimidation, providing them with, going after the companies that are involved in forced labor and surveillance. There's a lot that governments can do outside of the power of the sphere of the Chinese government. But we haven't seen those things being done because I think it's easy sometimes to criticize the Chinese government if you're on the other side of the geopolitical competition. But it's harder to actually uphold these standards and provide redress to victims. Of course, any effort is commendable again. But on the other hand, we want to see consistent advocacy for human rights for all governments in all situations. And that means that when allies are abusing human rights, these Western governments should speak up, criticizing allies. And of course, that has been a long-standing ask we have, and it has been difficult to hold universal standards.
Right. I mean, I was just going to add that, Emmanuel Macron was in China recently,
right,
having a love fest. I don't recall, not that I followed it closely, any discussion of the Uyghurs being on the agenda. So I think this very much, just reinforces what you've just stated, Maya, about the consistency of speaking out on human rights, not just in words, but also in deeds as well in terms of policy. So we have about 3 minutes left. Maybe we can take one last question, Sophie, if there is one, and then we'll get the panel to quickly answer it, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. Yeah. So Maya did bring up the fourth question, which I didn't read out loud, but she did a great job answering about how Western states should navigate the universalism versus cultural relativism debate present when states condemn China's actions. If anyone else wanted to touch on that, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I have a follow-up on kind of the US response.
Yeah, go ahead and read it quickly, and then
Okay,
what the panel choose.
Sure. So the question was, in the US, is there a potential irony that a future Republican administration, while no friend of Islam Muslims, could actually be a good thing for the Uyghur cause? High-profile Republicans, DeSantis and Rubio, have actually been very vocal on the Uyghur issue, using it as a stick to beat China with. Anyone wants to jump in?
Yeah,
there?
anyone wants to jump in on any of those questions very briefly, and then we'll conclude. Going once, going twice. John, you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. I think, like Maya kind of mentioned in a previous answer, that, it's very easy, these days to bash China, especially because, it'll get, a lot of traction on both sides of the political aisle in the United States. Whether or not, a future DeSantis or Rubio genuinely cares about the cause or the plight facing the Uyghurs, I think is a separate issue. But, I think it makes for a very good talking point for, people like Rubio or DeSantis, who are kind of reaching for straws while they're trying to beating the drum against China. But I don't see, them personally, I don't see them bringing anything nuanced or new to the table on actually solving this crisis. I think what you'll see is a continuation of, rhetoric without substance.
Yeah, can I add?
Yeah, go ahead, Omar.
Yeah, one thing that I want to mention that, Marco Rubio, US Congress passed 2 legislation. One is Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, and the other is Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So both these legislation, they sponsor, both of these legislation was introduced by Marco Rubio. So that's just, I wanted to mention that,
Good. Very good.
Introduced this legislation, and this legislation, 2 legislation is law now, is Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, was, in June last year, started to be implemented. So this is one of the things that Uyghurs count a lot, that maybe this economic pressure will, force China to back off. But in that case, as Maya also indicated, we need a international coordination, not only the US, but European countries, other Western countries also do the same thing, and prevent at least the ban or entering of the product tainted by forced labor. Otherwise, China will use those countries as dumping grounds. So the efforts of the US will not be as effective as we want.
Very good. Okay. I want to thank everyone, particularly the panelists, for their time. I want to thank the viewers for tuning in. I want to thank the 2 sponsoring organizations, the Uyghur Human Rights Project and Democracy in the Arab World Now. We've only scratched the surface of this topic. I'm hoping that we can perhaps do a follow-up event, perhaps in person, in the coming months. Thank you, everyone, for your attention and your time, and hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.